how did just a handful of European nations and, later the United States manage to dominate huge parts of the globe in the 19th and early 20th centuries? It's a really complex story, often uncomfortable, but absolutely essential world history.
It really is.
And for you students in Mr. A's world history class, this is your deep dive into Unit 4, Imperialism. We're aiming to help you crush those central historical questions, those essay prompts, on your upcoming exam.
Exactly. This whole era, it laid so much groundwork for the world we live in now, shaping landscapes, economies, even cultural identities that we still see today. Understanding this unit is really key for connecting the dots.
Totally. And that's what we're doing today. We're going to unpack your source materials, help you get beyond just the facts, and really understand the why and the how behind this massive shift in global power.
Yeah. Think of this as your guide to tackling the tricky bits of imperialism, getting you ready.
Okay, so let's start right there. The first big question on your exam review. What exactly is imperialism? It's a big word, sure, but what does it actually mean when we say one country dominated in another?
Right. So at its core, imperialism is when one country pushes its influence politically, economically, culturally onto another country. It's basically about a dominant nation feeling it needs to control others, often pretty aggressively.
So it's more than just trade.
Oh, much more. Your sources really highlight how in the 19th and early 20th centuries, European nations especially just exploded outwards into Africa and Asia. And they used different methods, sometimes direct military force, just conquering territory, sometimes setting up these huge economic spheres of influence where they controlled all the trade and resources, or even outright annexation, just claiming the land as their own colony.
No, just taking it.
Yeah, it wasn't about setting up a little trading post. It was about total dominance. Fundamentally changing the map, sometimes literally redrawing borders, wiping out existing ways of life. It's really one nation imposing its will completely on another.
Okay, that makes sense. Long-term, systemic control, not just passing through. And that scale.
Well, it leads right into our next big question, doesn't it? That central historical question about the complex motives. How did all these different reasons together drive European imperialism in the 19th century? It clearly wasn't just one thing.
No, definitely not. It was this powerful mix, often overlapping, of different desires and beliefs pushing these nations out. Your materials break it down into 5 key categories, which is super helpful.
Right.
And understanding these motives, how they connected, is absolutely crucial for your exam. It's the why behind it all.
So what were these powerful desires? Let's get into these 5 categories. It really shows how many different angles there were to this.
Absolutely. Not just one reason, but a potent cocktail of them. Let's break them down. Grasping these is key to understanding the whole period.
Okay, first up, economic motives. This seems like the most obvious one sometimes, right? Just follow the money. Yeah, that's often a huge driver, no doubt. The core desire here was, well, profit. Increasing trade, sure, but crucially, creating new markets for all the stuff pouring out of Europe's factories thanks to the Industrial Revolution.
Right, they needed customers.
Exactly. And they also desperately needed raw materials. Things like rubber, cotton, tin, minerals, palm oil, diamonds. Stuff they needed for their industries, and they wanted it cheap. Plus, cheap labor to get it all out of the ground.
Like that diamond mine example in the sources.
Perfect example. The diamond mine in South Africa, classic economic motive. Diamonds are incredibly valuable. But, like your source points out, it also kind of hints at an exploratory motive too, right? Because they were mining in a new area.
Interesting overlap.
Yeah, the economic engine of industry was just constantly demanding more fuel, more inputs, more places to sell the outputs.
Okay, then there's the political motives. This sounds like, I don't know, a global game of risk. Nations trying to grab more territory than the others.
Huh. That's actually a great way to think about it. There was intense competition between European countries for global dominance. Grabbing more territory than your rivals was a really clear way to share power, gain prestige, assert your nation's superiority.
Boosting national pride.
Totally. That concept of jingoism, extreme, aggressive patriotism, you see it in that British children's book in your sources, bragging about how great Britain is, linking pride directly to owning the most land.
Right.
Or think about Henry Morton Stanley talking about the Congo being a blank they needed to fill. Sounds exploratory? Sure. But there's a huge political ambition behind that, claiming it before someone else does. And of course, security, setting up military bases, coaling stations around the world. Very practical power politics.
Okay, next up, ideological motives. These always feel, I don't know, the most disturbing, the beliefs used to justify dominating others.
They really are disturbing, and it's vital to get how insidious this was. The core beliefs were deeply problematic, rooted in this pervasive idea of racial superiority.
Social Darwinism.
Exactly. That twisted idea that survival of the fittest applied to nations and races. It implied that stronger, superior European nations had a natural right, even a duty, to dominate weaker, inferior
The
ones.
white man's burden.
That's the infamous phrase. It presented this idea of a moral duty to bring European culture, technology, government to so-called less developed regions, like it was a favor.
Huh.
But it masked incredibly racist and exploitative actions.
Like that cartoon from Judge Magazine. Britain carrying other countries.
Perfect illustration. So patronizing, so self-serving. This ideology wasn't just a belief. It was actively used to rationalize subjugation and violence, painting it all as somehow benevolent or altruistic.
Wow, okay, then there's exploration. The spirit of adventure, mapping the unknown.
Yeah.
Sounds almost romantic, but still part of the machine.
Yeah, it often paved the way. The core desire was genuine for some exploring uncharted territory, scientific research, adventure, learning about new cultures. Think Dr. Livingstone wanting to map Africa's interior. Your sources show this well. That sketch of Central Africa after Livingstone, marking unexplored areas, that's the visual. Stanley's blank, quote, fits here too. But this exploration often gathered crucial info about resources, geography, that then fueled the economic and political ambitions later on.
So knowledge gathering, that enabled exploitation.
Often, yes. And finally, religious motives, bringing Christianity, European values, often tied closely to that civilizing idea, definitely. The drive was to spread Christianity, but also European values and morals through missionary work. They often believed it was their sacred duty to convert non-Christians, save souls.
And they often mixed European culture with religion.
Completely. Look at that example of the Methodist Sunday school in Angola from your sources, clearly spreading Christianity. But as the source notes, it's also spreading European teachings, values. It shows how these motives weren't separate boxes, they worked together. Religion was often the first wave of European influence.
It really strikes me how intertwined, especially the ideological and religious motives were. Your sources point this out, both focused on changing beliefs and cultures.
They absolutely are connected, both aimed at fundamentally changing the beliefs and practices of native peoples, replacing their traditions with European ones. Religion focused specifically on Christianity, yeah, but ideology covered broader European culture, politics, social norms.
So different facets of the same impulse.
You could say that. Both ultimately serve to impose European ways of thinking and dismantle existing indigenous systems. The religious motive could almost be seen as a specific form of the broader ideological push, often providing that first, seemingly harmless point of entry.
Okay, so if you had to pick one, which of these motives do you think was, like, the most influential? The one that really provided the ultimate justification?
That's a tough one because they all reinforced each other, but I'd argue the ideological motive, that deep-seated belief in European superiority and the so-called duty to civilize, often provided the crucial justification for everything else.
The cover story.
Kind of, yeah. It was the narrative they told themselves and the world to make their actions seem legitimate, even moral. It put a benevolent face on what was often just brutal economic exploitation and political power grabs.
Like Leopold in the Congo claiming it was about civilization.
Exactly. Using ideology to mask the horror of the rubber trade, or the British talking about bringing progress to India while setting up an exploitative economic system. This ideology forced huge, unwelcome changes on indigenous people, demanding they abandon their ways for European ones. It let the imperial powers feel good about themselves while doing terrible things.
That makes a chilling amount of sense. Okay, so ideology provided the reason, the justification. But what gave them the means to pull this off on such a huge global scale? That's where the Industrial Revolution comes in, right?
Absolutely. This connects directly to that central historical question about how industry and technology drove the expansion into Africa and Asia. The Industrial Revolution created this insatiable hunger in Europe.
A hunger for what?
Resources and markets. Think of it like a giant factory. It needs constant fuel. Industrial production relies heavily on massive amounts of natural resources. Iron ore, cotton, rubber, palm oil, minerals, you name it. Europe just didn't have enough at home to keep up.
So they had to look elsewhere.
Exactly. Your sources, especially that imperialism simulation, show this interdependence clearly. You need raw materials to make things. The faster you make things, the more materials you need.
And then you have piles of goods. You
Yeah.
need someone to buy them.
Precisely. Production needs markets, people to buy the manufactured goods. If you find new markets, demand goes up, factories keep running, profits keep flowing. It drove them to find or create new populations to sell to, often forcing colonies to buy their goods, not make their own.
Sounds like a frantic race.
Yeah.
Get there first, grab the resources, lock down the customers.
It was a race. That's why we call it the scramble for Africa, right? Intense competition. European countries rushed to conquer territories in Africa and Asia to secure resources in captive markets before their rivals did. The speed, the aggression, it's tied directly to those industrial demands.
And Africa and Asia were, tragically, quite vulnerable to this.
They were, for a few key reasons. Technologically, many African and Asian societies hadn't industrialized like Europe. They often lacked modern weapons, advanced military organization, the ability to produce their own defenses against European armies and navies.
And they had what Europe wanted.
Exactly. They were rich in the very resources Europe was desperate for, so you had European greed meeting local disadvantage in terms of military tech. A perfect storm, making them relatively easy targets.
So technology wasn't just about making stuff, it was about taking stuff too.
Absolutely critical. Technology was the game changer on multiple fronts. At home, it boosted factory efficiency. But crucially, it enabled power projection. New rapid-firing guns like the Maxim gun, steamships going up rivers, telegraphs for communication, medicine like quinine against malaria.
Ah, right. Disease was a huge barrier before.
It was. These advances gave European nations an overwhelming military and logistical advantage. They could conquer, control, and extract resources faster and more effectively than ever before. Without that tech gap, 19th century imperialism wouldn't have happened on that scale.
And it seems clear from the sources that the well-being of the colonized people wasn't really a factor in any of this.
No, not really. The focus was almost entirely on maximizing benefits for the imperial power, extracting resources, creating markets, gaining strategic advantage. Little to no regard for the long-term effects on the colonized people, their culture, or their future ability to sustain themselves, that civilizing mission. Mostly a thin justification for exploitation.
Okay, this sets the stage perfectly for looking at how this played out on the ground. Let's zoom into Africa and India. These stories really highlight that contrast between the stated goals and the harsh reality. Essential for those exam questions about civilizing Africa versus the actual impact and whether British rule in India was mainly exploitative.
Definitely. These are prime case studies. They show the motives and methods in action and, importantly, the devastating consequences. Great material for your essays.
Let's start with the scramble for Africa, King Leopold II and the Congo. This is maybe the most infamous example of that disconnect between words and deeds.
It's truly horrifying, one of the darkest chapters. Leopold presented himself as this great humanitarian, said he wanted to bring progress, civilization, pierce the darkness, even stop the slave trade, all noble-sounding stuff, funded it privately initially.
But the reality
Yeah.
sounds like a nightmare.
The reality was unbelievably brutal exploitation, mainly for rubber, to make himself personally rich. Your sources detail the methods. Cutting off hands of villagers who didn't meet rubber quotas.
Cutting off hands.
Yes, as proof of punishment. Forcing people into unfair treaties they couldn't understand. Using ox chains that caused terrible sores. The chakot, that hippohide whip used for savage beatings.
God, that's barbaric.
It was. George Washington Williams, that American journalist, wrote an open letter exposing it all the cruelty, the moral failings. Estimates are around 10 million Congolese killed from forced labor, violence, disease. 10 million.
Unbelievable.
And that political cartoon in the rubber coils, showing Belgium as a snake strangling the Congolese, it captures that chilling contrast perfectly. High-minded talk, genocidal reality.
And this whole scramble was kind of formalized at the Berlin Conference, right? Where Africa itself had no seat at the table.
Exactly, which just underlines the hypocrisy. The Berlin Conference in 1884-85 was basically European powers getting together to figure out how to carve up Africa and its resources without fighting each other over it.
So, rules for the scramble.
Pretty much. European countries, the U.S. were there, no African representatives. It just reflected that deep-seated view of Africans as inferior, their desires totally disregarded. They just drew lines on maps based on European interests.
Which created all sorts of problems later.
Absolutely. Cutting across existing ethnic groups, kingdoms, and the map shows the result. France and Britain got the lion's share. Only Liberia and Ethiopia stayed independent. It was a land grab, pure and simple.
And once they had the land, they ruled differently. Direct versus indirect rule. What's the difference there?
Okay, important distinction. Direct rule. Foreign officials are brought in to run everything. No self-rule for locals. The goal is assimilation, make them more like the colonizer. Government, schools, laws are all based only on the European model.
Like the French often did.
Exactly. France tended to use direct rule in Africa. Bring in French administrators, impose French culture. The idea was often paternalistic, we know best. More control for France, but expensive and often met with more resistance.
Okay, and indirect rule.
Indirect rule. Use local rulers, chiefs, traditional leaders to administer the colony. They get limited self-rule, but they're ultimately controlled by the colonial power. The goal is less about full assimilation, more about developing loyal, local leaders.
Like the British preferred sometimes.
Yeah, Britain often used this, especially in big places like India or Nigeria. It was generally cheaper, needed fewer European officials, kept some local structures intact, which could seem less disruptive, but still maintained ultimate control and allowed exploitation. Had different long-term impacts, too.
Got it. Now, the Suez Canal. Huge strategic project in Egypt.
Oh, massive. Still is.
Yeah.
Built to slash the travel time between Europe and Asia, planned by a Frenchman, de Lesseps. Took 10 brutal years to build, mostly using forced Egyptian labor in horrible conditions.
Who owned it?
Initially Egypt, but they got into debt, sold shares to Britain. Britain eventually occupied Egypt to secure control. It was supposed to be international, but Britain held the reins for a long time.
And it was crucial for Britain.
Hugely. Cut the London to Mumbai trip nearly in half, from 12,300 miles around Africa down to 7,200 miles, made trade way faster, cheaper, essential for their empire's economy and navy.
South Africa also saw major conflicts. The Zulu Wars, the Boer Wars. Sounds like fierce resistance.
They were incredibly fierce. The Zulu War, British invade Zululand in 1879. King Cetshwayo resists fiercely. His warriors, mainly armed with spears, actually wiped out a large British force at Azanawana. A huge shock to the British.
But the British won in the end.
Yeah. Superior firepower eventually overwhelmed the Zulus. Zululand was annexed, became part of British South Africa. Then the Boer Wars. That was different. Europeans fighting Europeans.
The Boers were Dutch settlers.
The descendants of Dutch settlers, yeah. They had their own independent republics. But then gold and diamonds were discovered on their land. Late 1800s. That kicked off the big Second Boer War against the British.
And the Boers fought hard.
Incredibly hard. Used guerrilla tactics. The British response was brutal, burning farms, setting up concentration camps for Boer women and children, where tens of thousands died from disease and hunger. Really ugly stuff. Britain eventually won, solidified control over those resources, but at a terrible cost.
Moving north, France had a huge presence too. What were they after, and what was the impact of their direct rule style?
France, like Britain, wanted resources. Oil, gold, gas, timber, diamonds, uranium, a whole range. Their direct rule method, aiming for assimilation.
Well, the French saw pros like giving access to French education, courts, hospitals, though often serving French needs.
But the cons were big.
Huge, strict authoritarian rule, forced assimilation, trying to replace indigenous languages, cultures, legal systems with French ones. That direct approach often wiped out local differences, but ironically sometimes created a stronger, unified resistance against the French themselves.
And the French language is still widespread. Absolutely. That map showing French speakers across West and Central Africa, that's a direct legacy of French direct rule and those assimilation policies. Deep cultural impact, even as it erased so much.
Okay, let's pivot to India. The jewel in the British crown. Started with a company, right? Not the government directly.
Exactly. It began with the British East India Company. Got a monopoly charter from Queen Elizabeth I way back in 1600, grew incredibly wealthy and powerful, basically acting like a state itself.
And corrupt.
Notoriously so. Gained massive power, especially taxation power, after the Battle of Plassey in 1757. That's where Robert Clive made a deal to ensure victory. And famously, they were central to smuggling huge amounts of opium grown in India into China.
Ah, the opium connection again, linking India, Britain, China.
Yep, a key part of the economic exploitation. Britain needed something, China wanted to balance the tea trade, and opium grown in India, was it? Devastating for China, profitable for the company, connects directly to those essay questions on exploitation.
So why was India called the jewel in the British crown? What made it so uniquely valuable?
Several big reasons. One, amazing natural resources, especially raw cotton, vital for Britain's textile factories. Two, a huge population. Massive captive market for British goods, especially once India's own industries were crushed.
Yeah.
Three, strategic location. Perfect spot between England and China for trade routes and as a military base. Four, Huge tax revenue potential from that large population, funding the British administration and military. And symbolically, even the Kohinoor diamond ended up in the British crown jewels, literally taking the wealth.
But this didn't go unchallenged. The Sepoy Rebellion, a major turning point.
Huge, massive, bloody uprising in 1857-58, sometimes called a mutiny, sometimes India's first war of independence. Tensions had been rising, Christian missionaries causing fear, general British disregard for Indian culture.
And the spark was those rifle cartridges.
Yeah, the new Enfield rifle cartridges, greased with pig and beef fat, deeply offensive to both Muslim and Hindu sepoys who had to bite them open. Refusing was the trigger. The rebellion was widespread, violent on both sides, but eventually crushed by the British.
And the main outcome?
The British government dissolved the East India Company. No more company rule. Britain took direct control. That's the start of the British Raj.
So the Raj meant direct rule from London. How did that change things for India?
Big shift. Policy came from London, executed by a governor-general in India. Less local control than even under the company sometimes. Economically, Britain tightened its grip, forced India to supply raw materials, buy British goods, destroyed India's local textile industry, for example.
And socially?
Indians became second-class citizens in their own country, barred from top jobs, paid way less than the Europeans, like that engineer example, a British one earning 20 times more. This widespread discrimination, combined with the economic pain, fueled nationalism.
So the oppression led to resistance movements.
Directly. Groups like the Indian National Congress, the Muslim League formed, initially focused on reforms, getting more say, but eventually the demand grew for self-rule, for full independence. The shared experience of being under the Raj ironically helped forge a unified Indian identity against the colonizer.
Okay, let's shift to East Asia now. China and Japan facing similar pressures from the West, but reacting so differently. This comparison is crucial for your exam essay, contrasting China's resistance leading to collapse versus Japan's adaptation.
It's a fascinating contrast, yeah. Really shows how different responses could lead to vastly different futures.
Let's start with China. That political cartoon showing all the foreign powers carving up a dying China really captures the situation, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. China was under intense external pressure, and its experience was largely one of resistance, but often from a position of weakness. This ultimately led to more exploitation and the end of its imperial system. The Opium Wars are a prime example.
Right, the Opium Wars, driven by Britain wanting to fix its trade imbalance.
Exactly. China exported lots of tea, silk, ceramics that Britain wanted, but Britain had little China wanted, so silver flowed out of Britain. The British East India Company found a solution. Smuggle opium grown in India into China, demand silver payment. Hugely profitable for Britain, devastating for China. Millions got addicted.
So China tried to stop it.
Understandably, yes. Commissioner Lin Zexu confiscated and destroyed a massive amount of opium in 1839. Britain cried foul, claimed free trade principles were violated, and used it as an excuse for war.
And China lost badly.
Overwhelmingly. Britain's modern navy and weapons were just too much. China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. Really humiliating terms. Open more ports, allow opium sales, pay huge reparations, give Hong Kong to Britain. British citizens got special legal status. It massively damaged the Qing dynasty's prestige and opened the door for other foreign powers. A major step towards its eventual downfall.
And Lin Zexu's letter really shows the human cost, calling opium poison.
It's incredibly powerful. He describes how it seduced people, made them sickly, unproductive, ruined families, crippled society. The images in your sources reinforce that people looking gaunt, living in squalor, it wasn't just economic, it was social destruction.
Then came America's open-door policy. Sounds less aggressive, but was it really anti-imperialist?
Good question, and your sources raise it. The U.S. was worried about being shut out of China as European powers carved out exclusive spheres of influence. So they pushed for this open door in 1899, basically saying China should remain open to trade for all countries.
Protecting China or protecting U.S. interests?
That's the debate. While it was framed as protecting China's integrity, many see it as a subtle form of imperialism ensuring U.S. economic access without the cost of direct colonization. That cartoon showing Uncle Sam propping the door open with the U.S. military highlights the underlying power play.
And finally, internal resistance like the Boxer Rebellion actually hastened the Qing dynasty's end.
Yes, ironically, the Boxers, this anti-foreign, anti-Christian secret society, rose up around 1900. They blamed foreigners for everything, even natural disasters, attacked foreign compounds in Beijing.
How did that end?
A multinational Europeans, Japanese, Americans marched in and crushed the rebellion. China was forced to pay enormous reparations, banned from importing weapons. the key significance. This failure further weakened the qing, leading directly to its collapse in 1911. It fueled Chinese nationalism but ended the imperial era. China's resistance, without the necessary industrial power, led to more exploitation and ultimately revolution.
Okay, now Japan. Same pressures, totally different story. Strategic adaptation, not just resistance.
Exactly. This contrast is vital. Japan shows how adaptation could lead not just to survival, but to becoming an imperial power itself.
Japan had been isolated for centuries, right? Closed off.
Since the 1600s, yeah. Pretty peaceful internally, grew economically in its own way, but no Western-style industry. Then, mid-1800s, the West comes knocking. Particularly the U.S. under Commodore Perry in 1853.
With the black ships.
Right. Steam-powered warships. Japan was basically forced open. Your sources say the guns of the U.S. Navy gave them little room to refuse the Treaty of Kanagawa. It wasn't a choice.
But their response after being forced open was strategic. That feudal lord, Dainosuke.
A real visionary. He saw the tech gap immediately, argued they had to learn from the West to beat them at their own game. Used Dutch experts to build a navy, master Western tech, large guns, handling of ships initially in secret. The goal: control their own destiny, sail the oceans freely, not be dominated. That's adaptation as a survival strategy.
Which led to the Meiji Restoration. A massive overhaul.
Huge. From 1867, the old shogunate was overthrown, Emperor Mitsuhito restored to power. They ended feudalism, centralized the government, and launched rapid modernization. Industry, military politics, everything changed.
Why so fast?
The leaders, the Sacho reformers, knew they had to modernize to survive Western imperialism. The new system looked democratic constitution, parliament, but power stayed with an elite group, which allowed for incredibly fast top-down changes. A unique mix of modern and traditional control.
And then, quite incredibly, Japan became an imperialist power itself.
That's the twist. Japan lacked space, resources for its own industrial growth. They saw how the West got rich from colonies, so they copied the model, went after cheap labor, raw materials like from Korea, Manchuria, and markets for their own goods.
And they even beat a European power.
Yeah, the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-05. Japan defeated Russia, a massive shock to the West. Proved a non-Western nation could master industrial warfare and become a major imperial player. Changed everything.
So Japan's path.
Yeah.
Forced opening, strategic adaptation, modernization, becoming an imperial power. Completely different from China.
Completely different outcome. Strategic adaptation, however ruthless, allowed Japan to avoid colonization and become a colonizer. A complex legacy for sure, but a powerful example of a different response.
Okay, let's cross the Pacific, the United States. Was American imperialism different or just another flavor of the same thing? That's a key CHQ for you all. How did the U.S. pursuit of security, economy, strategy compare to European imperialism?
Right. A really important question to think critically about for the exam. The U.S. often framed its actions differently, promoting democracy, regional stability. But if you look at the methods and impacts, lots of similarities to Europe.
Let's start with the Monroe Doctrine back in 1823. Sounds like hands off the Americas, Europe.
That was the message. President Monroe declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to new European colonization, saw Spain trying to reassert control in Latin America as a threat to U.S. security and interests. In return, the U.S. promised not to meddle with existing European colonies.
Was it imperialism itself, though?
That's the debate your sources raise. It wasn't direct colonization then, but it absolutely asserted U.S. dominance over the region. Kind of like declaring the Americas the U.S.'s backyard gave the U.S. a huge advantage. Many see it as a form of economic and political imperialism, setting the stage for later interventions.
And the overthrow of Hawaii, that seems pretty clear-cut imperialism?
Oh yeah, much less subtle. In 1894, American missionaries, business interests, especially sugar and pineapple planters like Dole, backed a coup against Queen Liliuokalani. A straightforward power grab.
And Hawaii was annexed soon after.
Became a republic under U.S. control, then annexed by the U.S. in 1898. Direct acquisition of territory for strategic naval reasons and economic gain. Very much in the mold of European colonialism.
Then the Spanish-American War in 1898. Kicked off by the USS Maine sinking.
It was the trigger, yeah. Cuban rebels were fighting Spanish rule. The Maine explodes in Havana Harbor, likely an accident, but yellow journalism in the U.S. blamed Spain. Public outcry pushed President McKinley into war.
Quick war.
Very quick. Spain was weak. The Treaty of Paris gave the U.S. almost all of Spain's leftover colonies. The Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico. Cuba got independence, but under heavy U.S. influence.
And the U.S. ended up fighting in the Philippines for years.
Right. The U.S. wanted the Philippines for access to Asian markets, a naval base. But Filipino nationalists who'd fought Spain then fought the U.S. Long, brutal war. The Philippines didn't get independence until 1946.
So how similar was this to European imperialism?
Well, the result was the U.S. controlling overseas colonies, classic imperialism. Using military presence, public opinion for territorial gain, also very similar, the difference. It came from fighting another European power, Spain, not just taking land directly from indigenous rulers. A transfer of empire, in a way.
Got it. And finally, the Panama Canal. Massive strategic project.
Absolutely huge. The U.S. was determined to build and control a canal there. Why? Link the Atlantic and Pacific coasts for the U.S. Navy, massive power projection advantage, easier access to South and Central America for trade and influence, too.
How big the land? Colombia controlled Panama then, right?
They did. U.S. negotiations with Colombia failed, so Roosevelt switched tactics. Directly supported Panamanian rebels wanting independence from Colombia. Promised U.S. Navy backup if they revolted.
Hey, they did.
Yep. Quick revolt. U.S. Navy prevents Colombia from intervening. Panama declares independence, immediately signs the Habanova Treaty giving the U.S. control over a 10-mile-wide canal zone in perpetuity, plus the right to intervene in Panama. A clear case of using diplomatic pressure and military muscle to get a strategic goal, imperialism in action.
Wow. Okay, but imperialism wasn't just accepted passively. People fought back. Creatively. Courageously. Your materials break down resistance into 4 types. Analyzing these is key for your short answer questions on the exam.
Absolutely. Understanding resistance is crucial. It wasn't just one-sided domination. And it's important to see how effective different strategies were and why.
Let's start with military resistance, direct fighting.
Right. Military resistance is basically targets of imperialism waging war, officially or unofficially, against the colonizers. Violence on both sides. The problem. Usually the colonizers won because of superior weapons.
Pros and cons.
Pros. If you win, it can be quick, immediate freedom. Con. Huge human cost, high risk of failure, often leading to even worse repression afterwards.
Okay. Then intellectual resistance, fighting with ideas, culture.
Exactly. Intellectual resistance is indirect, making arguments logical, emotional against imperialism. Also, crucially, maintaining your traditional culture, customs, language instead of assimilating, seeing cultural survival as defiance.
Vicious in fighting.
Likely less violent, yeah, more people might participate, but not risk-free. Advocating independence could get you jailed, and it can take a really long time to change minds or build a movement.
Next, adaptation. We saw this with Japan, using the colonizers' own tools.
Precisely. Adaptation is also indirect, embracing Western ways, technology, military structure, even political ideas to strengthen yourself. Maybe even build your own empire, like Japan did.
Pros and cons there.
Pro. Can lead to modernization, avoiding colonization, even becoming powerful yourself. Con. Might mean losing some traditional culture, maybe adopting morally dubious practices like imperialism yourself.
Yeah.
A complex trade-off.
And finally, sabotage. Sneaky resistance.
Huh. Yeah, you could call it that. Sabotage is indirect, finding clever, often hidden ways to undermine the colonizers' power, profits, or systems.
Less risky.
Can be. More people might be able to do small acts, but it's usually not quick. And by its nature, it's harder to see in the history books, designed to be invisible sometimes.
Let's look at examples. Military resistance. Ethiopia stands out. They actually won.
Ethiopia, or Abyssinia, is unique. One of only 2 African nations to avoid colonization, had a long history as an empire. The conflict with Italy came from a disputed treaty in 1889. Italy claimed it made Ethiopia a protectorate. Ethiopia rejected it.
And they fought.
They did. And at the Battle of Adwa in 1895, Ethiopia decisively defeated the Italians, a massive shock to Europe. Italy sued for peace. Ethiopia demanded recognition of its independence and got it.
Why did they win when so many others lost?
Combination of factors. Italy was maybe unprepared, underestimated Ethiopia, but Ethiopia was also well organized, unified under Emperor Menelik II, and had managed to acquire some modern weapons, a rare but significant success for military resistance.
Okay, intellectual resistance. Ghana. How did that work?
Ghana, then the Gold Coast, won independence in 1957, largely through nonviolent organized resistance. Methods included boycotts of British goods, mass protests like that Servicemen's March in '48 where police firing on peaceful protesters sparked riots.
Who led this?
After World War II, educated professionals, lawyers, merchants formed groups like the UGCC and later Kwame Nkrumah's CPP. They targeted not just the British but also the local chiefs who collaborated under indirect rule. Nkrumah's positive action campaign involved nonviolent strikes, non-cooperation. People just stopped shopping, stopped doing business.
So hitting them economically and politically.
Exactly. Showed the power of organized, nonviolent mass movements, even though it took time and came with risks.
Adaptation. Japan revisited. Nanosky's plan really was about learning from the West to eventually stand alone.
Absolutely. His observations after Perry arrived were clear. Learn Western naval skills, gunnery, navigation. Use foreign experts initially, but master it yourselves. The goal wasn't just to copy, but to become independent, powerful enough to sail the oceans freely, control their own destiny. It worked so well they didn't just resist, they reversed the dynamic.
And sabotage. Indochina had some amazing examples. The anti-imperialist vegetable.
Ugh. Yeah, it sounds funny, but it was clever. Indigenous people used mobile crops like corn and cassava. Easy to grow, low labor, could be planted in remote areas. This let people move around, avoid forced labor gangs, and fix taxation systems the French relied on, undermined colonial control over agriculture and labor.
And the Hanoi rats.
That's brilliant.
Classic. French paid locals for rat tails to control the sewer population. Locals started just catching rats, clipping their tails for the bounty, and releasing them. Rat population exploded, French treasury went broke, paying for useless tails. Hilarious and effective sabotage.
Even French education backfired. Often, yes. Intended to create loyal subjects, it gave people like Nguyen Tai Hoc and Vuong Nguyen Giap the intellectual tools knowledge of democracy, nationalism, revolution to fight against French rule, formed networks, shared ideas, and even small symbolic acts, like that official stealing a curtain from a Dutchman challenged authority, sparked questioning. Sabotage could be big or small, visible or hidden, but it showed people constantly pushing back.
Wow. We have covered an incredible amount of ground today. From the motives driving empires to the experiences in places like Africa and India, the contrasting paths of China and Japan, U.S. imperialism, and all these forms of resistance, a really dense unit for your class.
Definitely dense, but so important. Imperialism wasn't simple or uniform. Its effects were massive and are still felt today politically, economically, culturally. Understanding this unit isn't just about history facts, it's about seeing how our current world got shaped.
So, as you're reviewing for your exam, keep thinking about those central historical questions. They're designed to make you analyze cause and effect, power, resistance, consequences. Look for those connections.
Right. Don't just memorize. Try to understand the why and the so what.
And maybe one final thought to leave you with as you study.
Consider this. Those forces we talked about, economic competition, political rivalries, ideological justifications, the role of technology. In what ways do we see echoes or maybe new versions of those same forces playing out in global dynamics today? What does that tell us about power and influence in our own world? Something to chew on.